Verschmiert. Okay, David, this is the list if you want to mention. Welcome to the Wilson Center. I'm Hale Esfandiari, and I run the Middle East program at the center. We are very privileged to have today with us one of the top experts on the region, including Egypt. My colleague, David Ottaway. He's a senior scholar at the Wilson Center, and he was a former bureau chief at the Washington Post in Cairo. This paper, Egypt at the Tipping Point, and I would recommend for those of you who didn't pick up a copy outside, take one with you when you leave. Until now, the Middle East program published a report on most of the meetings, conferences we have held in the past, and we called it the Occasional Paper Series. We decided that from now on, once or twice a year, we will invite one of our either scholars or former scholars or fellows to write a long piece for us on the work they are doing. And David was very gracious to accept our invitation, and this is the paper you will see outside. As I said earlier, David was a foreign correspondent. He was a national security and investigative reporter for the Washington Post, and during his career, he spent 8 years in Africa, 6 in the Middle East and North Africa, and 2 in ex-Yugoslavia. He is the author of several books, including most recently The King's Messenger, Prince Bandar bin Sultan, and America's Tangled Relationship with Saudi Arabia. He finished the book at the Wilson Center, and he stayed on to work on a book that is taking him back to 6 countries where he lived or covered major stories, including Egypt. David, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to begin by thanking the Woodrow Wilson Center for its incredible support for many years now, and helping me put together and write books. The center is really something special for journalists in Washington and elsewhere, because it's kind of a neutral zone in the war among think tanks here, because it has no particular viewpoint and it's not promoting any cause or issue. Journalists feel comfortable here and really appreciate the bipartisan, non-political nature of the Institute. As many of you know, Lee Hamilton is leaving, and we can only hope that we will have somebody coming after him who understands the best nature of the Woodrow Wilson Center and will perpetuate his tradition of maintaining the center as a neutral zone. I want to start, Hala mentioned that this is part of what I wrote and published, have published here, is part of this a book that is taking me back to 6 countries or stories. 3 of these countries I lived in. because I began to realize that in my lifetime I really had seen or witnessed some extraordinary things, like the assassination of Anwar Sadat in the stands with him, like I started in Algeria when 1 million French people fled the country in 1962 at the time of independence, and that's where I started my career as a foreign correspondent. We lived in Ethiopia when Haile Selassie was overthrown, and then a full-scale revolution totally turned upside down the society. It really was quite a revolution there. I was in Angola when the last Portuguese ship left, and the Cold War really got serious, or you might say the follies of the Cold War really took hold. And then we were in South Africa when Nelson Mandela walked to freedom. So I'm taking these experiences and sort of doing a then and now chapter for each of these 6 countries. And fortunately, I can go back and look at the articles I wrote from these countries back when I was there, so I have some baseline from which to judge what's changed and what's not changed. In the case of Egypt, upon leaving the country, I had written a 4-part series really dealing with, I was there when Mubarak, literally the moment he came to power, which is when Sadat was assassinated. So this is like bookends to a story. I'm witnessing the beginning of Mubarak and now watching his final years in power. So I have as a baseline the articles, a series of articles, particularly I wrote at the end, which really dealt with all the crises Egypt was facing in 1985, and Mubarak and his problems and what kind of a person he was. So I went back and looked at these articles before I went back to Egypt in January. So that was my baseline. And as I set off for Egypt, I had a number of questions in mind about, questions I wanted answered and things I wanted to look into. And certainly the main one, of course, was Mubarak's successor. Who was going to take over after him? Would it be a civilian or would it be another military person? Was the nature of the regime changing after 30 years of Mubarak in power? And finally, could this outside figure by the name of Mohammed el-Baradei, the former head of the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, make a difference by trying to run and become president of Egypt? Because el-Baradei is a totally different kind of opposition figure that the Mubarak's father and son have ever had to deal with before. Second question I was asking, what had changed since we lived there in terms of population growth, poverty, social classes, political and human freedom rights, political and human rights freedoms, were things getting worse, were they getting better, what was changing in the nature of the society. And then third question that came to mind was Egypt coming to the point where it might be ripe for some kind of what they now call color revolution? In other words, the kind we saw in Serbia and Ukraine and Georgia. You had kind of a soft overthrow of a government by the crowds in the streets. And I had written a book by John Bradley, who had been in Egypt in 2009, and the book is called Land of the Pharaohs on the Brink of Revolution. So I was obviously curious, was this possibly true? And then, if you remember, during the summer of 2009, there had been all kinds of demonstrations in Tehran, in outcry against the rigged elections there. And, my question was, could that possibly happen in Cairo? Could Cairo see what Tehran had seen in 2009 because of rigged presidential elections? Another question I was asking, looking into, was what had happened to Egypt's economy, which had been in the doldrums for decades. And I wanted to see whether there was any sign of a sort of economic takeoff after 30 years. And in that regard, I came to Egypt from Turkey, where I had been on a tour of Turkey with a businessmen's association representing the small and medium-sized entrepreneurs of Anatolia, where the Islamic AK party, if you want to call it Islamic-oriented party, really has its base, and where businessmen had played a very important role in the rise of the AK party and then in moderating its Islamic tone. So I was curious whether, in going to Egypt, Egyptian business people were playing or could play some similar role in the transformation from a military to a civilian government, possibly in Egypt. In other words, was anything happening in Egypt with regard to the Muslim Brotherhood similar to what had happened to the Islamists in Turkey, where they had moderated themselves and then become part of the political system and eventually come to power? Was Turkey possibly going to be a model for what would happen to Egypt? You perhaps don't remember, but let me remind you, the Muslim Brotherhood had, in the last elections of 2005, gained 88 seats in Parliament and become the major opposition force in Parliament for the first time in its history, the history of Egypt. So there was some reason to think about where was the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt going to go next. So could Turkey be a model for Egypt? So I tried to answer, I looked into, and I asked people these questions as I went around talking to all kinds of people. As you'll see, many of them, the interviews are taken. I try to give a lot of space in this article to the voices, what Egyptians think about Egypt today and where it's going and whether democracy is possible. And but I take the reader there and sort of what it's like arriving in Cairo today, 25 years later. I mean, what's the airport like? Anybody who's ever been to Egypt, the traffic is just unbelievable. And everybody talks about the traffic. I mean, it sort of dominates conversation from the moment you arrive. Everybody is always cursing it, and it's hard to get anywhere. It always was. So I take the reader on sort of a drive through Cairo and what it's physically like, the new suburbs that are developing, and try to describe the change in the social classes, who's in the upper class, who's in the middle class, the incredible discrepancy that has grown between the upper class and the lower class. But I try to give you a feeling for kind of the feel of what it's like driving from Egypt up to Alexandria, sort of the physical landscape of Cairo and how it's changed since we lived there. Now, I don't have time to go into all my findings, but I did want to talk about a few main ones. Finding number one, the incredible willingness of Egyptians to continue enduring the horrendous social conditions in their lives. Egypt now, 44% of the country is living on $2 or less a day. The official minimum wage hasn't changed since 1984, and it's like 35 pounds, which is like $7 a day. I mean, while they're actually negotiating contracts trying to over 1,000 pounds a month. But it's just the grinding poverty, the Egypt teeming with 20 million people, you just wonder how Egyptians continue to put up with it. And it's why you can readily come to the conclusion that if Egypt is not on the brink of revolution, as John Bradley wrote, you kind of wonder, well, why isn't it? I mean, how do people put up with this for year after year after year? And I had written about these horrible conditions of the Cairo traffic in 1985, and it was still the same, except that now there are two levels. So there's a gridlock up above and gridlock down below, and then eventually you have to come down, and there's massive gridlocks where these highways that run above the city come down onto the main highway, the main streets of the city. So how is it possible that they keep putting up with this? I mean, it is amazing to me. Egyptians grumble all the time, but instead of throwing stones, they create jokes about their own living conditions. So there's this kind of escape from these conditions through humor, which is really quite extraordinary. And I'm going back there again, thinking about the traffic, which I write about. I think if the Egyptians ever get fed up with the traffic and decide to do something about it, like having a massive traffic jam, to tell the government something's got to change, we'll know that the mood of the mass of Egyptians is changing, and maybe we are on the brink of some kind of social revolution. Finding 2. Frankly, despite all I've just said, I did not find Egypt on the brink of revolution. And I did not find it about to produce, a color revolution like we saw in Eastern Europe or in Ukraine or Georgia. There's plenty of reason, as I've just described, for why it might be there, but it isn't. The government has found ways to allow just enough safety valves to keep the pot from exploding. And they're masters at this. They give in just enough to the workers to keep them from forming an alliance with other disgruntled elements of Egyptian society in some kind of coalition that might cause trouble. They give the intelligentsia a free press, or enough of a free press, that they're not ready to go into the streets and lead mass demonstrations. They're relatively happy, as you'll see in quotes from talking to journalists and publishers there. They deal with the Islamic challenge from the Muslim Brotherhood. And they allow just enough leeway for them to, even as they keep pounding away, to keep them from becoming a major player. But they allow them just enough leeway to keep going, and they play the game so far. So I don't see the elements at this point of Egypt about to explode, even though it should. Finding 3, the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is the largest, best organized, most powerful, I'm going to call it a party, but it's not allowed to be a party, force party in the country. But they've kind of reached an impasse and a dilemma. There's a lot of debate here in the United States and in Europe about whether Muslim Brotherhood is kind of the best hope for, or the main obstacle for the development of a real democracy in Egypt. If you keep them out, you can't call it a democracy. I mean, how can you have a democracy that excludes the major political party of the country? If you bring them in, they could well end up dominating and running the parliament. And so, what are the consequences of that? Well, while this debate goes on, the Mubarak government in the last 2 years has decided that whatever we think, and whether the Muslim Brotherhood, which, by the way, has not been involved in any violent activity inside Egypt for decades now, while we're debating about, how they should try and deal with the Muslim Brotherhood and whether they should be given free rein in the political system or not, the government decided no. They're not going to have 88 seats the way they had in the 2005 Parliament. In fact, they're driving them out of the whole political process. They've reduced, they have made sure that they win no seats in the municipal elections, which were held, 2 years ago. The Shura Council elections, which are Parliament, there's a kind of National Assembly, there's a People's Part, and then there's the Shura Council, and they've made sure they don't have any candidates there. And talking with the Muslim Brotherhood leaders, one in particular whom I quote at some length here, they think they're going to end up in the elections in November, if they're lucky, with 5 to 10 seats. And then, amazingly, the way this is done, the Muslim Brotherhood negotiates with the government ahead of elections, more or less what they're going to be allowed to get in Parliament. So, talking about the fix being in, but that's the way things are done in Egypt. That's the kind of democracy they have there. So the Muslim Brotherhood, I think, they're really in an impasse because their attempt to get involved in the political process and show that they can be responsible players has been blocked. And they've got to decide now whether they just want to get out of the system altogether, and there are some in the Muslim Brotherhood arguing that, or to, soldier on and try and keep a foot in the system and wait for an opportunity to play a bigger role. Finding 4, which is kind of, by the way, I'll talk more about that, but they've decided their best hope is now El Baradei, and they're supporting him in a big way, and I'll explain a little bit more about that later. Finding 4, which is really summarizing the biggest changes I felt and saw going back there after 25 years. First of all, whatever we think, there are now 26 private newspapers, and the government is allowing a degree of debate never seen before in Cairo. So if you talk to the reporters and publishers and editors, they're really quite pleased with what's happened. And they feel greater freedom, and they appreciate the greater freedom, even though there are still red lines that they respect pretty much. And if you cross the red lines, you're likely to end up in jail or a lawsuit. And the red lines are, you don't talk about the military, you don't talk about the national security and what it's up to, and you don't talk about Mubarak's private life or the family's private life. So, and they know this, so they'll tell you, well, here are the red lines. So it's clear in their reporters' minds what they can write and not write. But still, from their point of view, there's a lot more freedom than they've ever had before. The other thing that's really striking is vastly increased social disparities. One diplomat said to me, what's really striking is the conspicuous wealth and the conspicuous poverty. It is really overwhelming as you visit that place. So the extremes are just getting richer and poorer, and the divide is growing. And who knows where that's going to lead, but it is really obvious. The other thing is, since the middle of this decade, 2004, the Egyptian economy has really begun to take off. Finally, they put a lot of businessmen into the government, and it has finally found you feel a sense of dynamism, and their GDP is finally growing. There's a sense of life in the economy, which you never felt. Well, everybody tells me it just wasn't there before 2004. And then finally, the biggest change is maybe, for the first time, we're seeing an opportunity where the nature of the regime may change. And it would be the first time, possibly, since the advent of the 1952 revolution when Nasser came to power, where there's going to be a change from military to civilian rule. So my overall impressions of that country, the economy and the polity and the society are all going in different directions at the same time. And I had a sense that Egypt was losing its equilibrium. Something would happen, short of revolution. But economically, it's become far more liberal and dynamic. Socially, it's moved far more to the right. Islamic elements are really sort of setting the cultural norms of society rather than sort of Western influence norms. And politically, it's become far more authoritarian in the last couple of years, even though there's a freer press, because the government is clearly uptight about what happens after Mubarak. So they're really cracking down on everybody that poses or could pose a serious threat to them. So this is what makes Mohammed el-Baradei's run for the presidency even more interesting. Now, talking about the political future of the country and going back where I started about what after Mubarak, a couple of observations. Whatever you think of Gamal Mubarak, and most of the intelligentsia and the critics inside Egypt and even outside here in the United States don't want or worried about Gamal, his son, becoming the next president, because it's just so typical of the Arab world where father sets up son to take over and you have family dynasties created. Even if that happens, Gamal represents at least a change in who is naming the leader. Gamal is not the military's candidate. Nobody thinks Gamal is close to the military. He is the party's candidate. He's, of course, his father's candidate, but he's used the party, gone up through the ranks of the party and to become a top leader, not the top leader, but positioning himself to become the new president. But he's used the party. That's the way it's happening. It's not, he hasn't gone and knocked on the barracks and, taken the generals out for dinner and that sort of thing. It hasn't happened. So even if he does come to power, at least we're getting a civilian leader in that country for the first time since the 1952 revolution. The other thing is, it's clear that he has not only the party's support, but he's got the business community's support, and that the business community is really beginning to play a political role in the country. And that was certainly different from when I was there in the early 80s. So Egypt could at least be at the tipping point from going from military to a civilian leader. Which in the history of Egypt is still something, whether you like dynasties or you don't like dynasties, and it's different, it's new. And Gamal Mubarak has been at the heart of the economic takeoff that country has finally experienced starting in 2004. Now, the other most interesting thing is this guy el-Baradei. He comes back from being the most, influential peacemaker as head of the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna. He's a Nobel Peace Prize winner. He probably has more international prestige than Mubarak. In fact, probably many would say, without a doubt. At least he's better known. He's played a role and well respected. So this is something different for the Mubaraks. How do you deal with this guy? Now, when I was there, he was just beginning to come back to Egypt, introduce himself, try to get support. He's gathered about 800,000 signatures for his campaign to change the Constitution, which would allow him to run, and other changes to make elections freer and fair. He's doing this all right now through petitions. There've been a lot of criticisms that he's too mild-mannered. He doesn't know what it's like to deal with Egypt, either the political elite and establishment or the street people. He certainly doesn't look like a street person when you see him. So people aren't sure whether he's really going to gain any traction in the society. But there are some interesting hints to my mind, and that's why it's not so easy to dismiss him, and he remains, there's just enough doubt in my mind about what he may end up doing that he could actually really cause the Mubaraks real trouble. And there are hints that he's becoming more radical, or at least more frustrated with the process of just doing things through petitions and sort of the legal methods open to him, which are not very wide or positive to his efforts. For one, he's called for a boycott of the elections in November. And I wanted to read for you some of the statements he's made in the last 10 days, which really make me wonder, who is this guy, and is he serious about what he's saying? On the elections, quote, "We will boycott the upcoming elections because anyone taking part will be acting against the will of the people." He says he will press on with his campaign to gather signatures for change before organizing peaceful protests. Mohammed el-Baradei organizing peaceful protests? I mean, this just, Cairo has never seen anything like this before. Then he goes on and he says the third stage of his campaign will involve, quote, "civil disobedience, as long as the government fails to agree to his calls for change." I mean, this is from the mouth of el-Baradei, this consummate diplomat. What's going on? Quote, "The decision to take to the streets if the regime does not agree to demands for change will be the beginning of the end of this regime." Just to give you a flavor. Then he talks about the whole political, in a interview with one of the privately owned newspapers, Al-Sharouk, which is one of the most popular private newspapers there now. He looks at he's describing the whole system to some of his supporters. And he says, he looks at the establishment. He refers to it as a temple. "When I look at the temple they built, the Mubaraks, I see a decaying temple nearly collapsing. It will fall sooner rather than later. I will never enter this temple. What we call for is to bring down this temple in a peaceful, civilized manner." I mean, this coming from el-Barak to me is really interesting. And it makes me wonder, I mean, is this guy going to take, his gloves off and get down in the street and lead peaceful protests? And I don't know what he means by civil disobedience, but, are we going to see big crowds maybe in the streets? It's hard to, I'm waiting to see a picture of this guy el-Baradei hauled off by the police, which is going to have an incredible impact around the world. But so how the Mubaraks deal with this guy is their dilemma. And the Mubaraks have set up two possibilities. Everybody thought I was told before I was there in January that Gamal was going to be the candidate, and he was definitely going to be running next for president. But as they were beginning to, the Egyptian elite, the Mubarak people, were beginning to see and weigh the impact that al-Baradei might have, many were coming to the conclusion that al-Baradei could beat Gamal Mubarak in a real election. And that if Mubarak Sr. can stay alive another year, he's 82, he'd be 83 at the time of elections. I don't know if you've seen any pictures of him, but he has trouble walking. He's gone through operations. He's not at all in good health. But if he's still alive in 2011, the presidential election, I think, is about a year from now, September 2011, that they might put him up and have him run because they don't think Gamal can cope with al-Baradei. Now, the other possibility is that they'll figure out some way to not eliminate, but put al-Baradei in the shadows, keep him out of the political process one way or another. And then maybe Gamal could run and without having to compete with al-Baradei. But nonetheless, my point here is that al-Baradei could well be a game changer. I don't know how the Mubaraks are going to deal with him, or they're just going to throw him in jail or drive him out of the country, or what they're going to try and do. But, they have to be careful how they deal with a Nobel Peace Prize winner. And so it's a real challenge for them. The other challenge is for al-Baradei to get down and organize people, and I'm waiting to see these peaceful protests he's going to lead, because al-Baradei, he wears a tie and a coat, and he looks like a diplomat who never had came up against the police or had anything to do with the street protests in his life. He's gone to a few small ones, but nothing large, nor has he tried yet to organize something large. But nonetheless, he's threatening to go to the streets and even civil disobedience, and I find this the makings for a really interesting next year in Egypt. I'll stop there.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, David. We'll now open the floor to questions. David, let me ask you the first question. Who are al-Baradei's followers? I mean, the intelligentsia, the workers? Who are they?
It's the young, I call them the pro-democracy activists. Mm-hmm. Much of it's in cyberspace. But they've signed the petitions. They're going around and getting signatures. You're beginning to see some signs of sort of grassroots where people go and sort of knock on the doors, ask people to sign petitions, that sort of thing. It's not the workers. It's not the business people. It's not the upper class yet. So it's a very, it's really the young pro-activists, pro-democracy activists who are rallying behind him. And now the Muslim Brotherhood has decided to back him. And I think this is going to be a bit of a problem for him, because having the Muslim Brotherhood as your main backer, and I say main backer because of the 800,000 signatures al-Baradei has managed to get in his petition calling for change, 500,000 of them were obtained by the Muslim Brotherhood. So it's clear that the Muslim Brotherhood is, I mean, they're the one, they are his main backer at this point. In the one hand, for him, it's good because he can, it's a way for him to actually get to 1 million. He's trying to get to 1 million signatures or higher. On the other hand, having the Muslim Brotherhood, al-Baradei, who's a secularist, if there ever was one, to have the Muslim Brotherhood as your main backer I think could be a real problem for him in trying to get any support from business people or upper class. So that's his main backers.
Yes, please. Just wait for the mic, please, and identify yourself, and then flip. Yeah.
Irene Tinker, University of California. You haven't said anything about the NGOs. Now, for years, they were highly restricted to Islamic ones, but then you had population groups, you had some human rights groups that went in and out. It seems to me there is a large group of intelligentsia and upper class who have been trying to be active. How does that figure?
A number of things to be said about that. Yes, you're right, but when you come to the pro-democracy groups, people I talked to, they gave me figures. You know, there are maybe 800 to 1,000 activists in these NGOs that are pro-democracy. The United States can't support them directly anymore because the Egyptian government says you have to go through us and we'll decide which groups you can give your money to. The U.S. government's tried to get around this to some extent by doing training for these pro-democracy groups back here in Washington rather than out in the field. But so yes, they do exist, but they're just behind the Muslim Brotherhood in the target for the security forces to keep them off the streets, throw them in jail. They tried to have some last around April 6th when it's kind of a movement. There was an April 6th movement, and they tried to have a demonstration, and the police came and arrested them all and threw them all in jail. So it's not easy. And these groups have to get out beyond the student, and they have to get out into the suburbs now. They have to learn how to make contact with other groups in society than themselves, which has, I think, it's a very restricted group. Egypt there's a lot of effervescence, but when you probe, you just realize so far it's a few thousand people in a society of 83 million or 84 million. So it's kind of taking place here in cyberspace and then occasionally down in the street, but they're in societies down here, and they really have to figure out how to connect with workers, with women groups, etc. And they're trying to do that. They're making some steps that way, but it's hard to be impressed because I do not find them, they're not able to get thousands of people or supporters out on the streets. But they have the potential, and some of them now are going out. I think this petition exercise has been good for them because they have to actually go and knock on doors and get people to sign. Well, that's the beginning of, getting a broader base of support.
Sure, Flip, but I forgot to announce that we are going to serve lunch after the meeting at 1 o'clock. I'm sorry, Flip.
Thank you. David, thank you so much. That's fascinating. Two questions. One is you talked about the growing importance of the business community, but I'm just wondering, are you talking about the mega business community? Are you talking, you use the Turkish analogy, are you talking about the growth of a middle range, as it were, business class, and if so, what is their relationship with the government? And the second question is, you're just talking about pro-democracy groups, and I'm wondering, would you incorporate in that human rights groups? Is there a difference between the two groups? Do they work together? Are the human rights groups and activists of any importance at all?
The business community, that's one of the things I was looking at, and I talked a little bit about it, quite a bit about it in the paper. Yeah. What's happened in the last decade is that Egypt has, like Russia, has its oligarchs. It's got I think the figures are like 100 large companies or oligarchs. Some of them are the biggest in the Middle East. And they decided a long time ago to go into the party. And they've pretty much taken over half the party, if not more. And they have the government now in power is a businessman's government. Many of them come from the business sector. Everything they've been doing is to make it possible for the economy to get going. So the oligarchs are with the ruling party. The medium and small-size entrepreneurs are having a really tough time getting going in Egypt. The banks don't favor them. You don't get a cent. A friend of my son's, whom I saw over there and is trying to get going, a small enterprise, there's just no support for them. And if they do want support, they find they have to go and make deals with the party and the government, which excludes them supporting the opposition. Because the party is so central to everything you're going to do in the government, loans, etc. Although the banks are more independent, but the banks are still tied in with the government. So but it's very hard. There is not a large class of medium-sized, small entrepreneurs. They are just beginning to try and form. And they're certainly not interested in supporting Muslim Brotherhood. So that was the second question. Human rights and pro-democracy. They're on the street together. The two issues are so tied together. And the pro-democracy people are using the outrages committed by the security people to try and organize their followers, and they go to each other's demonstrations. They're pretty much the same group.
My name is Stephen Shore. Is there any sizable Egyptian diaspora, and if so, does it play any role in the future of the country?
Well, it's funny you should ask that. The annual meeting of the Egyptian Americans starts tonight. It's 7100 Connecticut Avenue. And I've never been to their meetings before, but I'm going to go this time. And so I'll have a better answer for you. And all the opposition people are going to be there. El Baradei is supposed to give a televised, from Egypt or wherever he is now. I don't know if he's in Egypt or in Vienna. Talk to them. Are they going to play a role in this coming election, presidential election? I don't know. He's clearly wants to reach out to them because he wants to talk to them, at least by teleprompter or whatever. What do you call it? They'll see his voice and his face, but he's not going to be there. So I don't know which way they're going to go. I think if there were signs that El Baradei had a chance to change things, you might get some switching of sides and some of the business people perhaps supporting him. But there's so much doubt still about whether he has any chance at all of getting into the system and running, that I think they're, by and large, waiting to see.
The prerogative of the chair. David, what happened to Ayman Noor? It became a household name.
Yeah,
and
he's supposed to be there tonight and tomorrow, and I'll tell you.
In Egypt.
He still has his God party, which apparently there's somebody he wants to run for president, even if El Baradei does. One of the problems for the Egyptian opposition is it splinters hopelessly and ad infinitum. And so I don't know how many leaders are going to try to run, but of parties, these small parties that exist. But he still has political ambitions, and he's supposed to be there at this meeting this weekend. And we'll find out whether he's going to stay with El Baradei and support him, or do his own thing.
We are having many hands, so I would like to ask you, please, to make your questions very brief. Mansour, you had a question, but just question, please, no comment, no question. No, I'm sorry, you have 7, 8 hands. Yes, please. Just wait for the mic, please. Thank you. Yeah.
Roger Hardy, a British journalist currently at the centre here. Where does all this leave the Obama administration? Very simple question.
This is
You know,
brief question. Thank you. So everybody can get
No.
a word in.
Obama made some comments in his meeting with Mubarak here last week, or whenever it was, 10 days ago, saying, we want to see free and fair elections. He said this privately to Mubarak, apparently. He didn't say this out publicly. Most Egyptians I talk to think that the attitude of the Obama administration towards these elections is absolutely crucial. If there is no outside pressure, Mubarak's not even going to try to clean up his act in terms of holding fair and free elections. As you know, the peace process is being held off and on now in Egypt, and the idea that the Mubarak administration is really going to pressure Mubarak just when these talks, something has to happen in the next year, strikes me as unlikely that they're going to come out and put much pressure on him. On the other hand, if El Baradei is manhandled, I can see the picture, of El Baradei being beaten by the police on the front page of the American newspaper. Obama's going to have to just say something, do something. He can't ignore it. So they may, depending on what happens to El Baradei and how he's treated, the Obama administration may well take come out a more aggressive, you might call it, stance in favor of. Nonetheless, all the pro-democracy groups feel the Obama administration has really taken them off their list of priorities, and that they're not getting any support from the Obama administration.
Yes, the lady in the yes. Just wait for the mic, please. Sure. Have everybody there. Thank you.
Thanks for that interesting talk. My name is Dina Gergis. I'm a fellow at the Washington Institute. I had many questions, but I'll just restrict it to one since time is short. You spoke about macroeconomic reform being such a success story in Egypt. If that's the case, how then do you explain that poverty has grown to the level where 40% of the population lives under $2 a day, and that labor militancy in Egypt over the past 2 years has been really incomparable to most countries in the world? Thanks.
I attribute it to the failure of the American World Bank IMF theory of trickle-down. Turns out there is no trickle-down, and there have been studies of this in Egypt. What happened to the trickle-down theory? First you get the economy going, and it's supposed to trickle down, and everybody's supposed to benefit from it. So far, there's been no trickle-down. And so it's given people pause to think, how do you get a larger percentage of the society benefiting? Because there has been no trickle-down, and because in the process of going from the Egyptian economy has gone, when we were there, 2/3 of the economy was in the hands of the government. Today, 2/3 of the economy is in the hand of the private sector. It's been quite a change. In the process of selling off a lot of state companies, the first thing private entrepreneurs do is they realize there are 300% too many workers, because a lot of these state companies were just part of the social security network of Egypt's socialist economy. So you have a lot of people who have had to have smaller salaries, have been fired, accepted temporary employment, and which has generated an enormous discontent, not to mention that the minimum salary is ridiculous. $7 a day when 35 Egyptian pounds, when a lot of the contracts, it's got to be at least somewhere between 750 and 1,000 pounds as a minimum salary, but officially it's still 35. So there's just a lot of discontent. But the workers, for all their discontent and all their demands, are not joining any political movements. The workers are on one side and the pro-democracy people are on another, and they have not been able to figure out how to get together, or shown any, the workers have not shown any interest of getting together with the pro-democracy people.
Yes, please. Yes, here. And then we take another question.
Brief question.
Last question.
My name is Boris Lam, and I'm from more than a million Russians. That's what that meant. Well, and I would like to know, do you think that Egyptian-Israeli relations may change if El-Baradei can somehow take power?
Let's take the last question. Yes, the lady in the back, please. Sorry. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Kelly Memphis. I work with the International Association of Women Judges, and I'm sure you're aware of the recent controversy, 30 judges as opposed to the one woman judge previously on the bench. I was wondering what your observations are of the opinion of the government and the political parties about these women judges, as well as in the general population, general communities of Egypt.
Thank you. David.
On the women judges, I don't know. The only thing I know is that one of the issues in changing that El-Baradei is demanding is that the judges again take control of monitoring the political process, the voting process. As to the women's position and their problems, it's. I'm not going to comment. I don't know enough about it. Would relations change with Israel under El-Baradei? It doesn't make any difference who's there, but if there's an agreement, peace agreement, I think relations will improve.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking David, and lunch is served next door.